The quiet town of Cedar Falls, Ohio, had always been the kind of place where people trusted their neighbors and left their doors unlocked at night. With a population of fewer than 15,000, most families knew one another by name, and life was expected to move in a steady rhythm. But behind the closed doors of a modest two-story house on Maplewood Avenue, one of those families carried a darkness that no neighbor could imagine. The family consisted of Richard Miller, a 52-year-old factory worker, and his daughter Emily Miller, a quiet 16-year-old high school student. Emily's mother had left the household when she was only 6 years old, filing for divorce after years of what she later described to close relatives as Richard's controlling behavior and violent temper. For Emily, the absence of her mother created a void that Richard never filled with love, but with intimidation and cruelty. While outwardly he appeared to be just another hard-working single father trying to raise a daughter alone, the reality inside the house was a constant cycle of fear and abuse. Neighbors occasionally noticed Emily's withdrawn personality and the way she avoided conversations about her home life. Teachers described her as intelligent but distracted, often turning in assignments late or missing classes altogether. Some chalked it up to the challenges of growing up in a single-parent household. Others simply assumed she was a shy teenager struggling to find her place in the world. Very few could have guessed the extent of the suffering she endured each day. From a young age, Emily was subjected to both verbal and physical violence. Richard's drinking habits worsened after his divorce, and his rage became unpredictable. He would scream at her over the smallest mistakes, like forgetting to wash a dish or leaving a light on in her room, and those rages often escalated into physical assaults. At times, he locked her in the basement for hours as punishment, the cold cement floor becoming a cruel reminder of her helplessness. Over the years, the abuse took a heavy toll on her, not just physically but emotionally. She grew accustomed to hiding her bruises under long sleeves, even in the summer heat. By the time Emily turned 16, the abuse had escalated beyond bruises and harsh words. It crossed into territory that was darker and more traumatic, acts of control and exploitation that left her not only terrified but deeply scarred. She began to live in a constant state of survival, each day calculating how to minimize his anger, how to avoid being noticed, how to escape the grasp of his violence. Yet despite her efforts, Richard's aggression always found its way to her. In a community like Cedar Falls, where appearances mattered and gossip traveled fast, Emily felt trapped. She feared that if she told anyone, teachers, friends, or even the authorities, she wouldn't be believed. Her father, after all, was known as a steady employee at the local manufacturing plant, a man who mowed his lawn every Sunday and waved politely at neighbors as they passed. To the outside world, he was unremarkable, even respectable. To Emily, he was a nightmare that never ended. Her breaking point came gradually, not from one single event, but from years of compounded suffering. Each slap, each insult, each locked door in the basement built a wall of despair inside her. The thought of escape became an obsession. At first, she dreamed of running away, of disappearing into another city where no one could find her. But the reality of having no money, no relatives nearby, and no support system made that dream impossible. Eventually, another idea began to take shape, a darker one. Instead of escaping her father, she began to wonder if the only way out was to remove him from her life permanently. By the summer of 2018, Emily had quietly started to learn about household utilities, particularly the gas system in their home. She had paid close attention whenever repairmen came, memorizing valves, switches, and safety instructions. In her mind, the plan began to crystallize. If she could manipulate the gas line in the basement, she might be able to create an accident that would end her father's reign of terror once and for all. On the surface, Cedar Falls High School was like any other suburban school in Ohio. Students filled the hallways with chatter about sports, homework, and weekend plans. The bright murals on the walls tried to paint an image of optimism and growth. Yet for Emily Miller, those hallways felt more like narrow tunnels she had to survive each day. Her classmates knew her as the quiet girl who often kept to herself, rarely raising her hand in class or participating in after-school activities. What they didn't know was that her silence was not shyness, it was survival. Emily sat in the back row of most of her classes. She preferred the shadows where teachers were less likely to call on her. Though she was bright and capable, her grades had slipped dramatically in the last 2 years. She often stayed up late into the night, not because she was studying, but because her father's drinking and shouting kept her awake. Some mornings, she arrived at school with dark circles under her eyes and a stiffness in her posture, as though her body carried a weight invisible to others. Her best friend, Claire Thompson, had known Emily since middle school and was one of the few people who noticed the subtle signs of trouble. She often asked Emily to hang out after school, offering a safe space at her own home. Emily usually declined, worried her father would become angry if she didn't come home immediately. Still, Claire remained persistent, sensing that something about Emily's life was not right. Teachers too, particularly her English teacher, Mrs. Whitman, expressed concern when Emily stopped turning in assignments and seemed distracted during class discussions. But Emily had become skilled at deflecting questions, brushing off concern with forced smiles and vague answers. At home, life remained unbearable. Richard Miller's drinking had grown worse by late 2018, and his rages became more unpredictable. Emily's evenings were filled with chores, cleaning the house, cooking dinner, and making sure the bills were placed neatly on the counter where her father liked to see them. Any misstep risked a violent outburst. The emotional strain compounded when Richard began isolating her from friends. He would forbid her from attending school events or staying late for extracurriculars. His justification was always the same: "You don't need anyone else. You have me." The irony of those words haunted her. Emily's world became smaller and darker with each passing month. She had no close relatives nearby, and her mother, who lived several states away, had not contacted her in years. The legal system seemed inaccessible. She feared that if she reported her father's abuse, he would deny everything and retaliate even more brutally. And so, Emily endured, hiding the bruises, suppressing her tears, and burying her pain where no one could see. But the human mind has its limits. By early December 2018, Emily's thoughts of escape shifted from dreams of running away to meticulous plans for something more drastic. The basement of the Miller house became a place of grim focus. It was the same space where her father had locked her countless times as punishment, and ironically, it was now the place where she began to envision her freedom. She remembered every detail, from when a repairman had come to fix a leaking pipe 2 years earlier. The main gas valve near the furnace, the hissing sound when it was loosened, the way the smell spread quickly. She began sneaking into the basement when her father was out, practicing turning the valve just enough to release a faint odor, then closing it again before he returned. She studied how long it took for the smell to dissipate, how the old ventilation system worked, and how she could leave the house safely. Still, Emily wrestled with guilt. She was only 16, and despite everything, Richard was her father. There were moments when she doubted herself, moments when she wondered if perhaps she could survive just a little longer until adulthood. But those moments were quickly crushed by his next act of cruelty. One winter night, after a drunken rage left her with a split lip, Emily sat on her bed trembling, staring at the faint blood stains on her pillowcase. That night, her thoughts crystallized. This would not be her life forever. She also grew skilled at concealing her intentions. Around her classmates and teachers, she remained the quiet, withdrawn girl they had always known. With Claire, she sometimes allowed a trace of her pain to show, but never enough to reveal the full story. She feared if anyone discovered her plan, they might try to stop her, and she was convinced that failure was not an option. Her future, her survival, depended on ending her father's control once and for all. Meanwhile, in Cedar Falls, the Miller household blended seamlessly into the town's landscape. Richard's public persona as a hard-working, if somewhat stern, father remained intact. Neighbors occasionally waved when they saw him mowing the lawn or shoveling snow from the driveway. None of them imagined that behind the closed curtains of that two-story house, a storm was brewing, one that would soon explode, both literally and figuratively, changing Emily's life forever. By the end of December 2018, Emily's plan was nearly complete. She had studied the gas system thoroughly. She knew her father's routine: when he drank himself to sleep on the living room couch, when he retreated upstairs, when he was least aware of his surroundings. All that remained was to wait for the right night, the right moment, when she could ignite a chain of events that would finally bring her torment to an end. The night of January 12, 2019, began like so many others in the Miller household, quiet from the outside, tense and suffocating on the inside. Snow had fallen heavily across Cedar Falls, coating Maplewood Avenue in white and muting the sounds of the small town. Inside the two-story home, Emily sat on her bed upstairs, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling. She had learned to read the rhythm of her father's evenings like a clock. The creak of his recliner in the living room, the clink of a glass bottle, the rise and fall of his angry mutterings at the television. Each sound marked a countdown toward what she knew would be her decisive night. Richard had been drinking since late afternoon. The bitter smell of beer and whiskey wafted through the house. By 9 p.m., his words had begun to slur. By 10:30, he staggered upstairs, yelling at Emily to make sure the front door was locked before she went to bed. She nodded silently as she always did, and listened to his heavy footsteps as he retreated into his bedroom. The door slammed shut, rattling the picture frames on the hallway wall. Then came the silence she had been waiting for, long, deep breaths from behind his door, signaling that he had slipped into his alcohol or induced slumber. Emily sat frozen for several minutes, her hands trembling. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind countless times. Yet now that it was real, her body screamed with fear. What if she failed? What if he woke up? What if the explosion didn't work the way she imagined? A dozen terrifying scenarios rushed through her mind. But then she remembered the basement, the cold cement, the locked door, the smell of mildew that had clung to her hair when he left her down there for hours. She remembered the bruises on her arms, the humiliation of his cruelty. The fear transformed into determination. She whispered to herself, "This is the only way out." At 11:15 p.m., Emily crept down the narrow staircase, each step groaning under her weight. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the curtains. She carried a small flashlight tucked into her sweater pocket, careful not to make a sound. Her bare feet pressed against the cold wooden floor as she crossed the kitchen and opened the basement door. The air below was damp and heavy, and the familiar chill sent shivers through her spine. She flicked on the flashlight and descended the stairs, each creak magnified in the silence of the night. At the bottom, the furnace loomed like a shadowy beast, its pipes twisting like veins across the concrete walls. Emily crouched in front of the main gas valve, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would wake her father upstairs. She wrapped her trembling fingers around the handle and began to turn. A faint hiss filled the room, followed by the sharp, nauseating odor of natural gas. She gagged but forced herself to stay still. The basement quickly grew heavy with the smell. Emily knew she couldn't stay there long, or she'd risk passing out. She turned the valve wider, releasing more gas into the air, then stood and made her way back to the stairs. At the top, she paused, holding the door frame for balance. The house felt eerily silent. She tiptoed back to her bedroom, leaving the basement door cracked open so the fumes could spread upward. By midnight, the odor had reached the first floor. It mixed with the stale smell of alcohol and cigarettes in the living room. Richard remained asleep upstairs, oblivious to the danger seeping through the house. Emily sat at her desk, staring at her alarm clock as the red digits flicked forward. She knew the gas needed time to fill the rooms. She also knew she had to leave before it became deadly. At 12:30 a.m., she grabbed her winter coat and slipped quietly out the back door. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she stepped into the freezing night air. Her breath came in white clouds as she walked quickly down the alley behind her house. She told herself to keep moving, not to look back. The plan was to head toward Claire's house a few blocks away. She hoped that if anyone asked later, she could say she had gone there after a fight with her father, unaware of what would happen at home. She hadn't made it halfway down the block when the explosion tore through the stillness of Cedar Falls. A thunderous roar shattered the night, followed by a burst of orange flames lighting up the sky. The shockwave knocked Emily to her knees in the snow. Windows shattered, car alarms blared, and neighbors ran screaming from their homes. The Miller house was engulfed in fire, the roof collapsing as smoke billowed upward into the dark winter sky. Emily's ears rang from the blast. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her chest burned from the fumes she had inhaled earlier, and her eyes watered from the acrid smoke. But she was alive. Alive while her father remained inside. She stumbled to her feet, clutching her coat tighter around her trembling body. The distant wail of sirens echoed through the town, growing louder with every second. By 12:45 a.m., firefighters had arrived, their trucks lining Maplewood Avenue. Neighbors gathered in clusters, watching as flames consumed the Miller home. The scene was chaotic. Water hoses hissed, people shouted, and emergency lights painted the snow in flashes of red and blue. Amidst the commotion, Emily sat on the curb, her face pale, her body shaking uncontrollably. A paramedic approached, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and asking if she was hurt. She shook her head, unable to speak, her voice caught in her throat. Within an hour, firefighters confirmed what Emily already knew: Richard Miller had been killed in the blast. His body was found near the upstairs hallway, badly burned but identifiable. The cause of the explosion was initially assumed to be a gas leak, perhaps from aging pipes or a malfunctioning furnace. To most of the neighbors, it seemed like a tragic accident on a bitterly cold January night. But as the police began their routine questioning, one detail stood out. The daughter, Emily Miller, had not been in the house when the explosion occurred. To some, it seemed like a miracle. To the police, it seemed like a coincidence too neat to ignore. The morning after the explosion, January 13, 2019, Cedar Falls woke up to a scene that looked like something out of a nightmare. The Miller house was reduced to blackened rubble, its charred frames still smoldering against the pale winter sky. Yellow police tape cordoned off the property, and investigators moved carefully across the debris with flashlights and notepads. The smell of burnt wood and gas lingered in the air, a grim reminder of what had taken place just hours earlier. Detective Mark Ellison, a seasoned officer with 20 years on the Cedar Falls Police Department, stood with his arms crossed as he surveyed the wreckage. To most people, the fire looked like a tragic accident caused by a gas leak. But Ellison had worked enough cases to know that accidents often hid something deeper. His instincts told him this was one of those times. "Too clean," he muttered under his breath as he watched firefighters douse the last embers. The first step of the investigation was to determine the cause of the explosion. Fire marshals examined the furnace, gas lines, and electrical wiring. Early findings pointed to a deliberate release of gas rather than a malfunction. The valves had been tampered with, and there were no signs of natural wear that could explain such a catastrophic leak. To Ellison, this was the first red flag. Someone had turned that valve intentionally. Meanwhile, Emily sat at the police station wrapped in a borrowed hoodie, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been brought in for questioning, not as a suspect, at least not officially, but as the only surviving witness. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. Detectives approached gently at first, offering her water and assuring her they just wanted to understand what happened. Emily told them she had left the house around midnight after an argument with her father. She claimed she couldn't stand his drinking anymore and needed some air. She said she had been walking to her friend Claire's house when she heard the explosion. When asked why she didn't go directly to Claire's right away, Emily faltered, saying she just needed time to herself. The explanation sounded thin, but grief and shock often made people inconsistent, and the detectives made note of it without pressing too hard. Still, suspicions grew. Investigators found it unusual that Emily had escaped unharmed when the explosion happened so suddenly and so violently. Neighbors described her as lucky and miraculously spared, but Ellison thought differently. Luck was rarely so precise. Over the next several days, forensic teams combed through the remains of the Miller house. Among the debris, they discovered that the main gas valve in the basement had been fully opened. The mechanism showed no signs of malfunction. It had been twisted by hand. The fire marshal's report concluded that the explosion was the result of a deliberate act, not an accident. This finding shifted the investigation from tragic accident to possible arson and homicide. Detectives began piecing together the Millers' lives. Interviews with neighbors revealed a pattern. People often heard shouting from inside the house. Some admitted they had seen Emily with bruises, though they hadn't reported it. Teachers at Cedar Falls High School described her as withdrawn, troubled, and often exhausted. Claire Thompson, her closest friend, told detectives about Emily's reluctance to spend time away from home, hinting at a strict or even abusive father. Piece by piece, a picture emerged of a girl living in fear. This new perspective complicated things for Detective Ellison. On one hand, the evidence pointed to Emily having both motive and opportunity to sabotage the gas line. On the other hand, it also revealed a history of abuse that might explain her desperation. Was this the act of a cold-blooded killer, or a desperate teenager trying to escape years of torment? The investigation intensified. Emily's phone records were pulled, showing late-night searches in December for phrases like, "how to escape an abusive parent," "gas leak explosion," and "how fast natural gas fills a room." These searches painted a damning picture. They suggested not only premeditation but also a careful study of how to execute such a plan. For Ellison, this was the second red flag: too much knowledge, too much timing to be pure coincidence. When confronted with these findings, Emily broke down during a follow-up interview. Her tears spilled as she admitted her father had hurt her for years, though she avoided specifics. She told detectives she had dreamed of escaping but insisted she never meant to kill him. She claimed she only wanted to scare him, to force some kind of accident that would make him stop drinking and realize how dangerous he had become. But the words rang hollow against the mounting evidence. The deliberate opening of the gas valve was not the act of someone trying to send a warning. It was the act of someone who knew exactly what would happen. Still, Ellison hesitated to treat Emily like a hardened criminal. She was 16, young, fragile, and broken by years of abuse. The legal system was rarely kind to cases like hers, where victim and perpetrator blurred into one. To ignore her suffering felt wrong. To excuse her actions entirely felt dangerous. The detective found himself caught between empathy and duty, torn between seeing Emily as a survivor or as a suspect. By late January, the case had become a point of heated discussion in Cedar Falls. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "Tragedy or Crime," "Gas Explosion Leaves Town in Shock," and "Teenage Survivor Questioned in Father's Death." The community was divided. Some viewed Emily as a victim who had endured too much, while others whispered that she had planned her father's death all along. For Emily, each day felt heavier than the last. She returned temporarily to school under the watch of social services, but whispers followed her in the hallways. Teachers treated her with cautious sympathy. Classmates stared as though she were both tragic and dangerous. At night, she lay awake in the foster home she'd been placed in, haunted not only by the explosion but also by the knowledge that the police weren't finished with her yet. Detective Ellison knew the case was far from over. The evidence was damning, but the context complicated it. He sensed there was more to the story, something Emily hadn't confessed, something that would come to light only when the pressure became too much to bear. And so, the investigation pushed forward, teetering between tragedy and crime, waiting for the truth to fully emerge. By early February 2019, the investigation into the Miller explosion had reached a crossroads. Detective Mark Ellison and his team had gathered enough evidence to strongly suggest that the fire had not been an accident. Still, the question of who had tampered with the gas line lingered like smoke after a blaze. Everyone suspected Emily, but suspicion alone wasn't enough to secure a case. They needed something definitive. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a routine sweep of Richard Miller's personal effects, investigators uncovered a small notebook hidden in the top drawer of his nightstand. At first glance, it appeared ordinary: scribbled notes about bills, reminders for work, and a list of household chores. But tucked between the pages were darker entries, written in hurried scrawls that bordered on incoherent. The notes revealed disturbing details about Richard's mindset: rants about control, mentions of Emily being ungrateful, and cryptic lines like, "She needs to be taught who owns this house." But the most unsettling entry, dated December 29, 2018, read, "She watches me. I think she wants me gone. If she tries anything, she'll regret it. No one will believe her anyway. No one ever does." To Ellison, the notebook was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it confirmed what Emily had been hinting at, that her father's abuse wasn't just imagined but deeply rooted in his disturbed psyche. On the other hand, it suggested Richard had been aware that Emily might act against him. If he had suspected she would try something, then maybe she had followed through. The notebook didn't exonerate her. It complicated the narrative even more. Meanwhile, Emily's behavior began to shift. At first, she was timid during questioning, often crying or withdrawing. But as weeks passed, she grew more defiant. During one interview, when pressed about her internet searches on gas leaks, she snapped, "You don't understand. Nobody ever helped me. I did what I had to do." Though she quickly backtracked, the statement sent shivers through the room. It was the closest she had come to admitting intent. The twist deepened when investigators received results from a forensic sweep of Emily's laptop. Hidden in a deleted folder were saved screenshots of message boards discussing accidental deaths and news articles about house explosions caused by faulty gas lines. One file, dated January 5, 2019, contained detailed instructions on how long it would take for a basement to fill with gas depending on the size of the valve. It was damning evidence, far too specific to dismiss as mere curiosity. Yet, just as the case seemed to tilt heavily toward Emily's guilt, another discovery threatened to flip the entire narrative. A forensic analysis of Richard's blood, taken from samples recovered at the scene, showed his alcohol level was dangerously high, but that wasn't the only substance present. Traces of sedatives were found, strong enough to have kept him incapacitated long before the explosion. The revelation stunned investigators. Who had given him the sedatives? Did Emily slip them into his drink to make sure he wouldn't wake up? Or was Richard himself abusing prescription drugs in addition to alcohol? The toxicology report left the investigation hanging in the balance. If Emily had drugged her father, it would confirm premeditation beyond doubt. If Richard had taken the sedatives himself, then the narrative shifted again. Perhaps Emily only meant to scare him, and the explosion spiraled out of control while he lay unconscious. Either way, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred further. In the community, public opinion began to fracture. Some neighbors rallied behind Emily, arguing she had endured years of abuse and finally snapped. "She's not a criminal, she's a survivor," one local resident told the Cedar Falls Gazette. Others, however, saw the evidence piling up and concluded she was a manipulative teenager who had orchestrated her father's death. The divide became so heated that town meetings turned into shouting matches, with people debating whether Emily deserved compassion or punishment. Detective Ellison himself felt torn. He knew the evidence pointed toward Emily, but every time he looked at her, he saw not a calculating killer but a broken child pushed to her limits. Still, his duty was clear. He needed the truth even if the truth was brutal. The final twist in the midpoint came from Emily herself. During a private counseling session arranged by social services, she confessed something shocking, not to the crime itself but to the intent behind it. According to her counselor's notes, Emily admitted she had thought about killing her father hundreds of times and had rehearsed scenarios in her head. She described walking into the basement night after night, practicing turning the valve. She even admitted she knew exactly how long it would take for the gas to spread. But then she added something chilling: "The house wasn't supposed to blow up like that. I thought I'd be inside when it happened too. I thought maybe it would take us both." The confession, though not a legal admission, revealed a startling new layer. Emily had not planned a clean escape. At least in her mind, she had considered dying alongside her father. The explosion was not merely an act of murder, it was also an act of desperation, possibly even a distorted attempt at escape through death. This revelation reshaped the investigation. Was Emily guilty of premeditated homicide, or was she a suicidal victim who triggered a chain of events she only half understood? For Detective Ellison, the answer remained elusive. All he knew was that the story had become far more complicated than he ever imagined. The case was no longer just about a girl killing her abusive father. It was about blurred lines, survival instincts, and the haunting question of how far someone could be pushed before breaking. When detectives dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the explosion, the case began to shift in ways that no one had anticipated. What initially looked like an unfortunate domestic tragedy started to reveal signs of something far more deliberate. By the second week of September 2019, the authorities had collected enough evidence to piece together a disturbing possibility: the blast might not have been an accident at all. The first twist came when the fire investigators analyzed the basement. They discovered that the gas valve had been tampered with in a way that could not have been accidental. The knob was deliberately forced open and locked in place with a piece of cloth to prevent it from closing again. Moreover, the ignition point was traced back to a small electrical timer connected to an old lamp. It was primitive but effective, a setup that ensured the gas would eventually ignite even if no one was awake to strike a match. The discovery immediately altered the focus of the investigation. Instead of asking how the explosion had occurred, detectives began asking who had orchestrated it. And the question naturally circled back to Emma Carter. She was the only one who walked out alive. She was the one who claimed she had been in her room at the time. And she was the one who, according to neighbors, had recently been seen carrying tools and supplies down to the basement. But then came the second twist, which made the case even more complicated. When detectives checked through the family's old medical and social service records, they found a long paper trail of domestic abuse complaints. Emma's school counselor had reported suspicious bruises as early as 2015. A neighbor had once called the police after hearing screaming late at night. And Emma's mother, who had disappeared years earlier, had filed a restraining order against David Carter in 2007, only to withdraw it under pressure. This new evidence forced detectives to re-evaluate their assumptions. If Emma had indeed set the trap, could it have been an act of self-defense after years of abuse? The case was no longer clear-cut. What had seemed like a cold-blooded murder began to look like the desperate act of a cornered teenager. The third twist emerged during Emma's formal interrogation on September 15. When detectives confronted her with the forensic evidence about the tampered gas valve, she didn't immediately deny involvement. Instead, she broke down in tears. She spoke about nights spent locked in her room, about the bruises she hid from her teachers, and about the endless cycle of fear she lived in. Her words painted a picture of survival rather than malice. Still, her partial confession complicated everything. Prosecutors knew that intent mattered. If Emma had carefully planned her father's death, it was legally murder. But if her actions could be tied to documented abuse, the case might sway toward manslaughter or even justifiable homicide. What no one expected was the fourth twist: evidence pointing to another possible participant. Forensic technicians recovered a set of fingerprints on the electrical timer that didn't belong to Emma or David Carter. The prints were traced to a boy named Kyle Jensen, a 17-year-old classmate of Emma's. Kyle had been seen spending time with her in the weeks leading up to the explosion. He lived just 3 blocks away and often walked her home from school. When questioned, Kyle admitted he had been in the basement days before the fire. According to him, Emma had begged for his help, saying she couldn't take her father's violence anymore. Kyle claimed he only helped her set up the timer because she convinced him it was the only way to survive. He insisted he never wanted to kill anyone, but his involvement added an entirely new dimension to the case. Now there was a potential conspiracy. Detectives were torn. On one hand, Emma was a young victim of horrific abuse who might have acted out of desperation. On the other hand, she had roped in another minor, complicating the moral and legal boundaries of the case. The investigation, which had seemed straightforward at first, was spiraling into a maze of trauma, manipulation, and possible collusion. By late September, the media caught wind of these twists. Headlines in the Detroit Free Press screamed, "Was explosion murder or survival? Teen girl at center of shocking case." Public opinion fractured. Some saw Emma as a tragic heroine who had finally freed herself from a monster. Others saw her as a manipulative teenager who had orchestrated a deadly plot. The twists left detectives in an unenviable position. They could pursue murder charges, but doing so might paint the department as heartless in the face of a victim's suffering. Or they could push for a lesser charge, but that risked being accused of overlooking a calculated crime. The balance between justice and empathy had never felt more fragile. And as the case pushed forward into October 2019, one thing was clear. The story of Emma Carter and the explosion on Pine Ridge Road was no longer just about a fire. It was about abuse, survival, and the unsettling gray areas where morality and the law collide. By early October 2019, the case of Emma Carter had become one of the most debated legal stories in Michigan. What began as a house explosion in suburban Detroit had spiraled into a national discussion on abuse, teenage desperation, and the blurred lines between victimhood and criminality. Inside the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, the conflict reached a breaking point. Detectives and prosecutors sat around long wooden tables, arguing over the right approach. On one side, the arson and homicide investigators insisted the evidence was undeniable. The gas valve was tampered with, the timer was rigged, and Emma had admitted to planning at least part of the setup. To them, it was premeditated murder regardless of the abuse. On the other side were child protection advocates and psychologists, who argued that years of documented violence had left Emma psychologically cornered. They described her as a traumatized child, not a calculating killer. This divide wasn't just inside the office, it extended to the courtroom. On October 7th, during the preliminary hearing, Prosecutor Linda McCall laid out the state's argument in front of Judge Robert Kellerman. "The defendant," she said firmly, pointing toward Emma, "knowingly created conditions that led to the intentional death of David Carter. Abuse, no matter how severe, does not justify premeditated homicide." The defense attorney, Mark Rosen, countered with equal passion. He presented photographs of Emma's bruises, medical records from 2017 showing a broken rib, and school counselor notes describing her as withdrawn and fearful. "This is not the story of a murderer," Rosen declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "This is the story of survival. The system failed her for years, and when no one would save her, she took the only option she believed she had." The courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters filled every seat, sketch artists captured Emma's pale, trembling figure, and television crews outside broadcast live updates. The nation watched as a 16-year-old girl became the symbol of both tragedy and controversy. The conflict intensified further when Kyle Jensen, Emma's classmate, was called to testify. Standing nervously at the witness stand, Kyle admitted his involvement. He said Emma had begged him for help, swearing her father would kill her if nothing was done. He admitted he helped her set up the timer in the basement. His testimony shocked the courtroom because it shifted some responsibility away from Emma and onto himself. But prosecutors used Kyle's words to their advantage. "Ladies and gentlemen," McCall said to the judge, "we now have proof that this was a carefully orchestrated plan involving two individuals. This was not a spontaneous act of desperation, it was a conspiracy." Outside the courthouse, protests erupted. Women's rights groups rallied in support of Emma, carrying signs that read, "Protect survivors, not abusers," and "Emma deserves freedom." Others, however, marched with banners saying, "Murder is murder," and "Justice for David Carter." The city was divided, and every news channel aired nightly debates about whether Emma was a victim or a killer. At the center of it all, Emma herself seemed trapped in silence. During her hearings, she rarely looked up, her long hair shielding her face. But on October 15th, during cross-examination, her fragile composure broke. Asked why she hadn't simply gone to the police or social services again, Emma shouted through tears, "I did. I told my teachers, I told the neighbors, I told anyone who would listen. No one believed me. Everyone looked away. He locked me in my room, he starved me, he touched me, do you understand? No one came to save me. No one." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even Judge Kellerman had to pause before restoring order. That outburst was reported on every major news outlet the next morning. For many, it was the turning point in how the public viewed her. But the legal system was less forgiving. On October 20th, the prosecution introduced a new piece of evidence. Emma's handwritten notebook recovered from her bedroom. Inside were detailed entries about her father's abuse, but also chilling lines that prosecutors read aloud. "I dream of the house burning. I want him gone forever. Maybe the gas will do it. Maybe then I can breathe again." This revelation hit like a thunderclap. The defense argued it was the journal of a traumatized teenager, venting in secret. The prosecution insisted it was proof of premeditation. As tensions reached their peak, Emma's fate seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. The judge had to decide whether to send her to trial for first-degree murder as an adult, or recognize her as a juvenile acting under extreme duress. The stakes were monumental. One path led to life imprisonment without parole, the other to possible rehabilitation and eventual release. By the last week of October 2019, the entire community braced for Judge Kellerman's decision. The conflict had escalated beyond the courtroom. It had become a societal reckoning. Was Emma Carter a murderer who deserved punishment, or a survivor who had finally escaped the grasp of her abuser? Everyone knew that whatever the verdict, it would set a precedent, and Emma's life would never be the same. On November 1, 2019, Judge Robert Kellerman delivered his decision in a courtroom packed wall-to-wall with reporters, activists, and curious citizens. Emma Carter sat between her attorneys, clutching a tissue in both hands, her eyes swollen from nights of tears. Outside, crowds chanted and held signs, their voices filtering faintly through the courthouse walls. The judge began with a heavy silence, his words deliberate. He acknowledged the years of abuse Emma had endured, pointing to the evidence of police reports, school counselor notes, and Kyle Jensen's corroborating testimony. "There is no question," he said, "that this young woman was failed by the very institutions designed to protect her." His voice was steady, but the weight of his words hung over the room like lead. Then came the pivot. Judge Kellerman stressed that Emma's actions, tampering with the gas valve and planning the ignition, could not be ignored. This was not an impulsive act. It was carefully considered. However, context matters. The law must weigh intent alongside circumstance. When the ruling finally came, it stunned the courtroom. Emma would not face trial as an adult for first-degree murder. Instead, she would be tried in juvenile court on a reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. The decision meant she faced years in a rehabilitation facility rather than life in prison. Gasps rippled through the room. Some shouted in outrage, insisting it was too lenient. Others wept with relief, believing justice had finally recognized Emma as both victim and survivor. Emma herself collapsed forward, sobbing into her attorney's shoulder. For the first time since the explosion, she seemed to release the unbearable weight she had been carrying. In the days that followed, the public remained fiercely divided. Editorials in the Detroit Free Press praised the judge for showing compassion. National commentators on cable news accused the justice system of sending the wrong message, arguing that abuse should never excuse homicide. Kyle Jensen, too, faced consequences. Though his role was smaller, the court ordered him into a diversion program for juveniles, with mandatory counseling and community service. His testimony had likely spared him harsher punishment, but his name was now forever tied to the tragedy. For Emma, rehabilitation began in a juvenile facility outside Lansing. There, counselors worked with her daily, helping her process trauma and build coping mechanisms she had never been given at home. For the first time in her life, Emma had access to therapy, education, and a measure of safety. Reports from inside the facility noted that she often cried at night but was slowly opening up, even expressing interest in becoming an advocate for abused children one day. The house on Pine Ridge Road remained a blackened skeleton, a haunting reminder of the night everything changed. Neighbors passed it daily, some shaking their heads in sorrow, others whispering about the girl who had lived inside. By the end of 2019, the case had faded from the headlines, replaced by other stories. But for those who followed it closely, the moral questions it raised lingered. Was Emma Carter a murderer, or had she simply done what no one else would do, end her own nightmare? In the quiet of her cell one evening, Emma wrote in her journal, not of fire or death but of hope. Maybe now I can breathe again.